So this panel, we've been talking about the methanol industry all day, methanol industry resurgence, the huge potential of natural gas, what's going on from methanol from coal in China, the massive drive in China towards methanol vehicles going into mass production. The Jilly presentation to me was really very thought-provoking because we are so behind here in this country, it just not good on this issue. And we have so much potential if you look at our natural gas. It's, after all, so much cheaper to make methanol from natural gas than it is from coal, and yet the Chinese are moving forward full steam, and we are not in our automotive sector. So to change all that, industry, of course, has a huge role to play, but the partner in industry in this country is the policymaking community. And so this panel is all about policy. What's going on, more importantly, what needs to happen, what can happen, what are the mechanisms in which to make it happen, and what is the role that all of you have to play in moving things forward. So we have three wonderful panelists here, all of which have in their own way fought for fuel choice for a long time. Joe Cannon is CEO of the Fuel Freedom Foundation, but he's been working on this issue and on fuel issues since the Reagan administration, really. In fact, you used to work for Judge Gorsuch's mother. Just to let you know how long he's been working on these issues, right? When she was at the EPA.
You really have to focus on the length of time.
Well, you look very young, not a day over 25. So Brian Scretany, right next to him, has been a partner on these issues for a really long time. He is legislative director for Congressman Eliot Engel of New York. He is professional staff in the Foreign Affairs Committee, so he focuses on this issue not just from the energy side, but also from the geopolitical side. And those of you that have been on the Hill, that have worked on the Hill, interacted with the Hill, know that if key senior staffers are not on your side and have not made it their own personal goal to get things done, nothing gets done. And Brian, over the years, has made it his own personal goal to get things done. And his boss as well, whether it's Republicans or Democrats in control of Congress, they have been steadfast moving this issue forward, and we will talk about that. David Sandalow, also on this issue for such a long time, David. He was, to get your title, former Undersecretary of Energy, acting, right? But you were also really, when the Department of Energy also has a section that focuses on international energy issues, and you were Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs, and you traveled all over the world, China especially, to deal with these issues. And so you have special expertise on how countries can cooperate at the executive level to move these issues forward. Now you're at Columbia. Yeah. All right, so, and he also wrote a wonderful book, which I will let you kind of highlight. But let's start this conversation. Brian, let's start with you. Do you have an announcement for us? Or in waiting, an announcement for us? Something in process? Your mic is right next to you, should be.
Okay. Is that working? All right. Yes, we did reintroduce early this afternoon. Congressman Engel and Congressman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen from Florida reintroduced the Open Fuel Act. So that went in.
Yay.
That went in this afternoon. We are going to work as much as we can to drum up support and see what we can do to move it.
All right, so that's good news right off the bat. Joe, getting the grassroots engaged, but more importantly, getting the administration engaged are two different sides of this story, right? You have getting grassroots engaged, you have getting industry engaged, you have getting the Congress influenced by these two groups, and you have getting the administrative apparatus, EPA, the rest of the administrative apparatus, Department of Transportation, everybody focused on this issue.
What are we doing?
Yeah, what are you doing?
First, I want to say, getting back to your introductory remarks, I first heard of methanol as a fuel 36 years ago when I went to work at EPA as a political appointee. My real boss in those days was a guy named C. Boyden Gray, who was running the president's task force on regulatory relief, and I was the point person from EPA. So that's a long time ago, and I remember him talking about methanol and going, what is this? But turns out he was a man on a mission, and he's been a mentor to some generations of people in this area anyway. So thank you, Boyd. I don't know if you're still out there, but so in working with this administration, first of all, we've had a sea change. In every way, you can have a sea change in this. So we'd spent a good deal of our time working with the last administration, focusing on climate issues and why looking at alternative fuels was good for climate. We still believe that. We haven't changed that at all, but the message has a little less resonance in this administration. So we're focusing on energy security. Now we're focusing on energy dominance. We're getting the vocabulary down okay here. And we've run into both actually in Congress and in the administration, there are a couple of points that are challenging. One is this administration believes that we're done. We've won the energy independence problem, and so what are you talking about? And that's, of course, not true. And the second thing that we run into a lot is this kind of confusion about energy. You say the word energy, and it just means a lot of things. So we have tried to focus some of our arguments anyway on two things. One is there's electricity and transportation, and they're maybe slightly more connected these days, but they're still largely independent. And so we are 100% energy secure when it comes to electricity, and we're energy secure and have fuel choice. So if you're in Kentucky, you're going to get a lot of your electricity from coal. If you're in Oregon, you're going to get a lot of your electricity from hydro. And you've got hydro, nuclear, gas, coal, solar, wind. You have a whole range of things. Why don't we have that in transportation? So that's one point. Then I won't spend a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion already on the whole energy security issue, but just to bring it right down to the policy, there actually are two vehicles right now. So this administration, if all you do is read the newspapers and watch TV, it's very chaotic. And for what it's worth, I think it is kind of chaotic. But there are certain things that are happening in this administration that are very surgical when it comes to regulation and some policies. And one of those is looking at energy. So one arena to look at here is the president signed several executive orders relating to regulation, but one of them was called the America First Energy Policy. I don't remember the whole title of it. But it focuses on examining an administration-wide agency department examination of all regulations and other regulatory activities that impede the development of or, quote, use of, close quote, American natural resources. But most of that executive order, most of the activity come under the development. And so I guess what I would like to say is, and we would like to see this administration do, is focus on the, quote, use of, close quote, which is in the executive order. So how do you make a market for these natural resources, including particularly natural gas? So just like three numbers to think about. In 2016, this country spent $30 billion on coal. It spent $88 billion on natural gas. That's for all uses, chemical, space heating, et cetera. $266 billion on petroleum. Okay. How do we move natural gas into that? Most of that petroleum is going to transportation. How do we move natural gas in? So this administration could look at Department of Energy, EPA, Department of Transportation, and look at what do we do to move natural gas from that $88 billion market segment into the $266 billion market segment. So there are two activities, and I'll stop here. One is the activities generated by this executive order to look at, so look more systemically at use of, but there's also the CAFE standard midterm evaluation process that is being re-looked at. We filed comments, and a number of people filed comments critical of the midterm evaluation for not taking into account fuel and only looking at engine technology. And the fact is, if you look at fuel and engine technology together, you can easily come to a conclusion that you should have more, in the case of our comments, we're looking at ethanol because there's already a system for ethanol. There's already there are 20 million flex fuel vehicles on the road today that can use 85% ethanol. But EPA declined to look at fuel. So if they looked at fuel in the context of that midterm evaluation, you could come to a conclusion that I won't go into all here, but there are big benefits to the environment and to climate and to fuel efficiency if you have a higher octane fuel, which is both ethanol and or methanol, are a much higher octane fuel. So.
Yeah, it's a massive clean air benefit if you think about it. I mean, if you look at the clean air benefits in Brazil, clean air benefits in China, this is something that's, it's really low-hanging fruit, and we're not really taking advantage of it at all.
No, it's in some ways it's great. When you look at the Chinese example here, you look at the Brazilian, you look where India's going, you look at Israel's tiny, but even they're looking at other possibilities. So why aren't we taking advantage of the largest, deepest, cheapest form of affordable fuel in the world is in natural gas fields in the United States of America?
Now, when David was at DOE, one of the things he did, and it was like this pet project of yours, you created this interagency working group on methanol specifically to try and get the wheels of the executive branch kind of moving in sync on this issue. You know, what are the lessons learned from that? How important is interagency collaboration on this issue going forward? There's a mic, an extra mic there. Can you guys just, why don't you take mine in the meantime? And there are like 5 mics here. Yeah, okay, get that and I'll get you another one. I was sitting on one, there you go. Why not, right?
There we are. The answer to that question is interagency work is very important. And I'm going to come back and talk about it in a little bit more detail. But first I want to actually go back a little bit further because you referred to a book that I wrote about 10 years ago. Which, the name of the book was called Freedom from Oil. And when you referred to it, it got me remembering what inspired me to write that book. And what inspired me was, back in 2007, I'll never forget this, I went to a lunch with Newt Gingrich and about 40 other people. And it was actually the first time I had ever been in the same room with Newt Gingrich. And I'm sure lots of people in this room have been. He's an incredibly impressive guy, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, but he's a force of intellect. And I asked him a question. I said, what do you think we should do about our dependence on oil? And within the same week, I went to a lunch with Governor Howard Dean, who, left-wing Democrat in contrast to Newt Gingrich being a right-wing Republican. I asked Governor Dean the exact same question. And essentially, the two men gave me exactly the same answer. And I was struck by that. And I thought, you know, this is an issue on which there is the potential for enormous bipartisan cooperation, which we could work together and find common ground. And that's what inspired me to write a book called Freedom from Oil. I actually think in the 10 years since that time, this town has gotten significantly more polarized, and the opportunities for bipartisan cooperation, unfortunately, have shrunk a bit. But still, I believe firmly that there is a lot of opportunity for bipartisan cooperation in this area, and that it's going to take that in order to make any progress. Point number 1. Let me make a completely different point, because I'm curious, because I've been here for most of the day. I've been here for all the day. Could everybody from a U.S. auto company here raise their hands? One person from a U.S. auto company, okay. And anyone from a U.S. auto company, so one person. And we might get a few more hands on this. Are there anybody who's in the business of retail distribution of gasoline? So we've got one. Okay, here's my observation. This has been an incredibly powerful set of discussions and arguments. What we have in the room today, I think, are two sets of people. And pardon me if you don't fit in either one of them. One of them is the fuel side of this value chain. People who think they can make money because they're on the fuel side or financing the fuel side of this value chain. And the other are policy people who care about the policy implications of this. I think in order for methanol to make its way into motor fuels in this country, we need to have other parts of the value chain seeing that they can profit from this. And right now, my observation, and people can contradict me, is the vehicle manufacturing side of the value chain doesn't see how they can make money on this. I think they see this as a cost. That by and large, they see this as an incremental cost. If you're going to make us if you're going to mandate flex fuel vehicles, that's a couple $100 more a vehicle. It's going to increase my cost, decrease my sales. And the history has been that whenever that discussion came up, that there was resistance to it. And I think the same thing is true on the retail fuel distribution side. And that if you're going to put more corrosive fuels into the fuel distribution side, they're going to need to upgrade the infrastructure. So I think on the big picture question of how do we move this agenda forward, I think there's two general ways to do it. One of them is the business segments that already have a vision of how they can profit need to cut some deals with the business segments that don't. And I think, I'm not exactly sure how that would work. Maybe there's some creative business minds out there who can figure out how to do that because it's pretty dispersed industries. But if there's a way to do it, that'd be great. Another way is that policy could step in, and now I'm going to work my way back to the topic of this panel, because in many ways what we're talking about is a classic role for government. I mean, I was struck in the lunch panel, Jim Woolsey and Bud McFarland spoke very passionately about policy problems created by our dependence on oil, and that's a classic role for government. Government steps in and it says, okay, we've got a problem. One way we can solve it is by building up our military forces, but another way we can solve it is with some structural changes to our economy that reduce our vulnerability. But I think that's really hard to do these days, unfortunately. And I think it's hard to do for two reasons. I think it's hard to have government solutions to problems like this. One of them is the dysfunction of this town and the polarization. And just, this is a town in which Congress can't pass budgets, in which it's incredibly hard to increase a debt limit so that our credit as a nation doesn't go in the tank. It's really hard to get anything done in this town. And the second is there's a very strong anti-government ideology that pervades so much of the discussion in this town. That there is a strong view that government shouldn't be doing things. And we have a top aide of the President of the United States who is calling for deconstruction of the administrative state. So I think in that type of environment, it's very hard to use government as a tool to address this type of problem that we're talking about. I think, to go back to where I started, I think there really is a possibility of bipartisan cooperation on this issue, and that this is the type of area where I think maybe we could come to a consensus that government could play a role to help solve these problems.
Speaking of bipartisan, every single time the open fuel standard in its former incarnation was introduced, it's always been a bipartisan bill. And if you look, whether you're looking at the open fuel standard, which is kind of the simplest way to get this done, which would essentially like a seatbelt law or airbag law, if you sell a car in this country, it says it needs to be open to some sort of fuel competition for most cars. So it's very, very simple. If it's gasoline, ethanol, fuel flexibility, if it's something more expensive like CNG or vehicle electrification, whatever. But the flex fuel is the cheapest part, cheapest option. Or you look at a different type of policy that was introduced last session, and I think will be probably likely to be reintroduced at some point in this session, which is looking, and we're going to talk about prospects for CAFE reform and RFS reform and all that, but looking at the likelihood for the reform of the fuel efficiency standards and telling the auto companies, instead of imposing an even minor, tiny, under $100 cost of vehicle on you, let's look at the different side and say, we can save you thousands of dollars by saying that you can meet a big chunk of your fuel efficiency requirements by opening most of your cars to fuel competition. So that's kind of the two-bracketed approach. Both of these approaches have always been bipartisan, which reflects what you said. This is an issue that, for people kind of looking at it from a national perspective, is in the national consensus. People instinctively understand that it's not healthy, it's not safe, it's not economically or otherwise secure for the U.S. to be reliant on a strategic commodity from the most volatile region of the world. But Brian, looking at, first, two things. The issues that you have found have really driven members of Congress to focus on this. What have they been? Is it gas prices? Is it the security side, or what?
Yeah, and it depends a lot upon which members of Congress you're talking about, of course, and which party. And so different arguments make better headway with some members than with others. Just to back up a little bit to something that Joe was saying earlier, I mean, there is a difference, I think, between production and use of energy as far as policymakers are concerned. I mean, when we have members of the Foreign Affairs Committee from both parties coming to staff to talk about what they want to discuss in hearings. We've had a couple of hearings lately, especially in the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, focusing on either the Southern Hemisphere or the Northern Hemisphere. And members tend to focus on drilling rights. And which entities can come in and get access to which natural resources, and how the regulations of the country of jurisdiction will keep the waters safe and the people safe and the waters clean. I don't hear much interest at all from our elected representatives on how the fuel that we extract from the earth is eventually going to be used. And as you know, Ann, I mean, we've pushed this on the domestic side through the Energy and Commerce Committee for years. And every member of that committee, I think, knows our arguments, knows our positions, knows the issue, and it's gotten, traction at times with members. On the foreign affairs side, we see something very different. Members are they're more concerned about national security, and they're more concerned about the extraction of fossil fuels. So if we can educate the public and as a result, have them help pressure our elected representatives to really focus on the use of fuels, I think that can make a difference.
You know what strikes me in the Senate? There's an ability, in essence, to move things through the Senate without effectively going through a committee. If you get an amendment to a bill and it's passed by unanimous consent, for example, you can bypass the committee process. You can't really do that on the House, but it strikes me that if in some theoretical universe these types of bills were to make it to the floor in the House, out of the, let's say, parochial concerns of somebody who has a refinery in their district and is not really thinking of the national interest but says, I want to protect the margin of that refinery, we'd see a very, very, very different result.
I mean, that may be, but in the House, ultimately everything is controlled by leadership.
Yeah.
So it's Paul Ryan and his team that determines what comes up on the floor and what we vote on. So while committee chairs, and to a much lesser extent ranking members, have the ability to set their own agendas to a limited extent, really whether or not something comes up for a vote on the floor is going to be up to the Speaker. And the Speaker is going to listen to his members. So if you have a large size group of members of the party, the majority party, pushing on the Speaker for a vote, well, then maybe you can get one. But otherwise, it's a one-person show.
If I think about the Energy Committee now, and we look at the chair of the Energy Committee, which in the first time since I can ever remember is not an oil industry or auto industry guy, this is a huge, huge opportunity, right? Because Congressman Walden is from Oregon. Simon Zhang, are you still here? You should go meet him. No, really. I mean, what does Oregon have with respect to auto industry or oil industry? So I think for the first time in we're talking decades, right? Decades upon decades upon decades, there's a chair that doesn't have a particular industry kind of speaking in his ear as constituents, not just kind of as part of the national conversation.
I think that's right, and he has both. If he were to become a champion of the flex fuel cause, open fuel cause, he would still have both adversaries, and allies on the committee. You know, you look at the chair of the Environment Subcommittee, and that's John Shimkus from Illinois, who has been a partner of ours in the past on this issue. At the same time, you have two chair emeritus still sitting on the committee, Joe Barton from Texas, and Fred Upton from Michigan, who have not been nearly as friendly to us on this issue before. So while the chair may be open to our arguments, he's got a lot of voices whispering in his ears.
Okay, let's talk about what we might see in terms of vehicles to move things forward. So prospects for CAFE reform.
Well, I don't know what the prospects are, but if the president were to make this an initiative, the prospects would be very high.
One tweet, that's all we need, one tweet, right?
Well,
Set America free. Open the market to fuel competition. There we go, we're done.
you know, maybe we should be working on drafting tweets and not executive orders. I don't know. But most of what I think everyone in this room wants, or most people in this room want, could be done administratively. Yeah, it would be handy to have a piece of legislation, but that's complicated for all the reasons. But there is a bipartisan kind of win here. I mean, the high compression engines supported by high octane fuel can produce more efficient and cleaner cars and are better for the environment. I mean, Paris, I don't want to delve into the whole Paris thing, but it didn't even mention transportation, the single biggest thing that's not touched regulatorily from a climate perspective. So you've got a win there. The auto industry could come out of this really well, especially the domestic American auto industry, since we're all about American jobs now. Getting CAFE credits for multi-fuel vehicles is an enormous
You've spoken to them, right? I mean, you've sat with the auto industry and said, look, there's this proposal out there, introduced on the Hill, to give you, let's say, an alternative compliance pathway. So you could meet a significant portion of your CAFE requirement this way.
And they would...
They love it, right?
I cannot speak for them, but people that we have spoken to at some of the big auto companies would say, yeah, that'd be a great idea to get these credits for multi-fuel vehicles. But that's not going to come from them.
Right.
That has to come from the administration. You have to hook it up to not just the narrow area of CAFE and fuel efficiency and EPA, but connect that dot with a much bigger issue of energy independence, energy dominance, and making things good for American consumers. So there are economic benefits, environmental benefits, national security benefits out of this. There's a Venn diagram with a lot of shaded area in it here. And let me just make one personal note. I do come from the right. I was a trustee of the American Enterprise Institute for a lot of years. I have in my office a black, heavy, rotary dial telephone. If we hadn't been for government intervention, in this case, litigation by the government and a willing judge, Judge Green, to alter that whole communication system, we wouldn't have, well, I don't know if we wouldn't have iPhones today, but if we did, they'd probably be clunky and still owned by Western Electric, which, by the way, when you turn that black rotary dial telephone over, it says property of the Western Electric Company, not for resale. So the telephone company owned everything, the lines, the poles, the phone. So the point is a government intervention, and I'm speaking as a conservative, there's a need for government intervention, especially when you're looking at national security and environmental issues. Both of those, you can make a good conservative argument, need some government attention. And this is a perfect example where you can conduct multiple government objectives and put them into one thing, and you can do that administratively.
You know, you're giving me an opportunity to refer to Friedrich Hayek. Anybody here read Hayek? Any real true free marketeers here? So you know that Friedrich Hayek said where there's a role for government intervention in the economy, one of the few roles, it's to bust monopolies and cartels because they do so much damage to the economy. And if you think about the fact, I mean, sometimes you read the Wall Street Journal or Barron's and I'm astounded. I think, do these journalists actually read what they're writing? Because they say, oh, you know, the very good management, or we look forward to the management of the oil industry, or the Saudis promise to manage the oil industry to responsibly. If somebody said that about the computer industry, they'd be hauled before an antitrust court. Can you imagine? If any industry, if somebody talked about managing the industry to responsibly, I mean, that's just ridiculous. So we have a situation where the oil the oil market, despite our increase in production in the U.S., is still, as Bud said, at the margins. A large portion of the production comes from a cartel. And the cartel has its own motivations. I understand the Saudis. I understand the Iranians. You know, they need to meet their national budgets, and that's the way they meet their national budgets. They want to drive the price of oil higher. That is a very rational behavior on their part. But it's not beneficial for us. So it's ridiculous to me that we haven't taken action to do something on this. And people who kind of do 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, let's take part of Hayek, but not all of it, right? Let's ignore the fact that he said, here, there's a course for action, so let's see what the least bad course of action is.
Just one point on the cartel. It's not a monopoly in the classic sense, but it is a feedstock monopoly. So you have multiple sources of electricity. 93% of our transportation comes from one source. And the other truth here is that it doesn't matter, as long as that's the fact, it doesn't matter whether we import 1 barrel or 4 million barrels a day, which is pretty much where we are. We import the price of oil. And so to really defeat this feedstock monopoly, you need multiple sources. And I include electricity in that. I mean, anything that can weaken that concentration of a feedstock monopoly could be very helpful. Very helpful.
We call it, and you saw the book out there, some of you might have picked it up, called Turning Oil into Salt, right? Salt was once a strategic commodity because it was the only way to preserve food. The word salary comes from salt. You know, the city of Salzburg was the major salt kind of moving city. Soldiers used to be paid in salt, and countries their geopolitical status was determined by their access to and control of salt. But with the advent of first canning and then electricity and refrigeration, salt became irrelevant. We don't care how much salt we import. The world salt price hike won't bring us to its knees. You know, we don't care which countries control world salt reserves.
Just for the record, I do live on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. So
that's right. And the very lovely shores, indeed they are. So, you know, let's shift gears for a moment. Competition is key to reducing the strategic status of oil. So competition is key to making oil just another commodity. God bless whoever produces it, just like God bless whoever produces natural gas and coal and everything else. They can all compete on an equal footing for our fuel tank and for our fuel dollars. To me, there's huge potential here for international cooperation. And one of the things that you did at the DOE, and if you know, is work with China on various energy cooperation issues. How do you see that dialogue moving forward? What is important to put in place administratively and so forth to really keep the ball rolling so we can learn from what the Chinese are doing? So, you know, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler can follow in the footsteps of Fiat, but its partner, but General Motors, the rest of them, Honda, Toyota, can follow in the footsteps of Geely. So it's not, you know, we're not facing a situation 5 years down the line where your only methanol flex fuel car is not an American one.
I think it's a great question because I think this is an area where we can work closely and where U.S.-Chinese cooperation can really help to move the agenda forward. And I go back and forth between the two countries a fair amount. And one thing I've discovered is the strong mutual suspicions in both countries. It's interesting. And most of this audience is American, and so I think you're kind of familiar with the American set of suspicions. As I usually hear it, is they're going to steal our jobs or they're going to steal our technology. And then as an American, I go to China, and what I hear in China is they're trying to contain us. They're trying to keep us down. And so there's this overlay, and you got to overcome that in order to, and it's not easy because these are deeply held cultural views on both sides. But there's, you know, I mean, you've had some very compelling presentations from Chinese speakers in this conference, and that's just an example of the type of technology work that's happening in China right now, and particularly in the energy sector, the advances in deployment right now are astounding. I mean, you know, China leads the world in clean energy deployment right now. China has more wind power deployed. China has more solar power deployed. By the way, the United States generated more wind power and generated more solar power because some of those plants are sitting idle in China. But they'll catch up. And China, is leading the world in all kinds of areas right now. And so there's a lot of potential for our two countries to work together. It's something that's had bipartisan support. When I was in the Obama administration, when I arrived in the Obama administration, I was very pleased to find that Treasury Secretary Paulson, under the Bush administration, had built an architecture for cooperation between the US and China on the set of issues that I was working on, and it was very helpful. We did a lot of work in this area, and I was just in Beijing last week, and actually Secretary Perry was over there at a meeting called the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is a big multilateral meeting, but proposing different ways of working together. So I think this is absolutely an area that the U.S. and China can work together on, and if we do, then we're going to move the world forward faster in it.
You know, when you think of how fast things move in China, I always remember, the different times almost every year going to China, looking at Beijing, looking at the changes are just amazing from visit to visit to visit. But one of the things that was most astounding to me years back was the extremely rapid introduction of, there are millions of electric vehicles in China. Most of them are mopeds and bicycles. But if you go to Beijing, you will not find one two-stroke motor on a moped or a motorcycle. You will not find one. You will see tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands.
20 million a year sales of electric motor scooters.
The numbers are
20 million a year.
amazing.
Yeah.
And people, they just take the battery, go up to their apartment and charge it there. So they just
Yeah.
kind of completely overcame the infrastructure issues that way. So if you think of how fast China has moved on electric vehicles, I was very grateful to Peter Gross for coming in and showing us the kind of EIA is getting engaged on methanol. But what struck me is we often underestimate what China is about to do, because nobody would have guessed, 20 million unit sales. Electric vehicles, it may not be the type of electric vehicles that we think about, but that's how a lot of people move from one place to another.
And by the way, this is also a very important export opportunity. And Simon Zhang spoke to this. This is, and this is an area that, by the way, that also has bipartisan support in our country. I think all Americans are in favor of exports, and there is a real opportunity for exporting U.S. LNG, exporting U.S. methanol, exporting U.S. natural gas in different forms to China, and there's a huge amount of interest in that topic right now in both countries.
One of the things that we spoke about when Simon Zhang was speaking afterwards, I asked him, look, they're building these huge plants in Washington State, in Oregon. They have the tremendous support of Governor Inslee in Washington, really engaged, and yet kind of this is going to be back to you, that there's this, and to both of you actually, there's this fringe portion of the left of the left of the left that says no to everything, that's protesting these plants, that stopped one of the plants in Washington State. We're talking about natural gas to methanol. There's no way that this is cleaner than gasoline. Exported to China, it's cleaner. I mean, it's clean any way you look at it. So saying you don't want natural gas converted into methanol is saying, I don't know what, you want to go back to the caves or something. You want to go back to unicorn power. I don't know. How do we overcome this issue?
I don't know. No, but really, I mean,
he's like, I do not want to see my comments on YouTube and have lots of people calling my office.
No, but that's entirely true. There is a keep it in the ground faction of the environmental movement, which does tremendous work in terms of promoting, wind and solar and other forms of power that are used for electricity. There isn't the equivalent of that in the transportation sector that I've seen. And so perhaps part of the solution is to make a clearer distinction between the electricity that powers our homes and the fuels that power our vehicles. The other thing I think is timelines. There are folks who want tomorrow's technologies completely implemented today. And while there may be a role today, that role is limited. And how you convince folks that use of the renewable fuels, use of alcohols, methanol, ethanol in our vehicles is something that we can start with now and grow over time. Is just, I think, part of the education campaign.
And that's actually an excellent point that you make, because if you look at the left side of the environmental community, it's thinking natural gas, electricity, they have this allergy to fossils, but the idea really is to force them to confront the fact that if you're looking at the transportation fuel market, it's not natural gas or nothing. It's natural gas-based fuels versus oil-based fuels. Choose. You have to choose one, right?
Not to inject too much of a note of despair here, but there is an environmental side, the environmentalist side to this, and that is anything that delays
the
the universal
electrification?
adoption of electric vehicles is a bad thing. I've spent a chunk of time with ARB in California and with some other environmental folks here in Washington, and that is a very deeply, deeply held view. And in California, it's their policy. Now, there have been some little indications that they might understand that the rate of electric vehicle adoption is not what they hoped it would be, but that's just a speed bump. I mean, there really are people, regulators, totally dedicated to electric vehicles. So if I were in the oil industry, I might be thinking, how can we make sure that there are internal combustion engines on the road for a long time to go, a long time down the road, and that might be looking at how to get higher octane fuels out there, even if they're not 100% petroleum. But there is a war between EVs and not EVs.
And I think I can say the way in contest, every single one of the people right here is an plug-in hybrid and electric vehicle advocate and supporter.
Right.
So we're saying this out of love. This is
No,
not
my only point is that
right?
if you look at the rate, even the most optimistic rate of electric vehicle penetration, listen, the founders of our organization have 5 EVs between them, the two of them. It's not, in the year 2050, there's still going to be somewhere between 1 and 3 billion internal combustion engines vehicles on the road. Okay, how are you going to power them in the cleanest way possible? One of those ways is high octane alcohol fuels.
Did you still want to jump in,
That
or
was-
that was what you wanted to say?
That's what I want to say. I agree. So, look, like you say, I'm a strong believer in electric vehicles. I think they're a big part of our future. They're important for the transition to clean energy, and they are not in opposition with clean alcohol-based fuels.
Yeah, it's all about Lego pieces working together. And if you think about it, just like a plug-in hybrid or an electric vehicle gets progressively cleaner as the grid gets cleaner, the same thing with a flex fuel car. It gets cleaner as the fuels get cleaner, and much more so a flex fuel plug-in hybrid. So it's really not rational to block out one portion of these solutions by saying we believe there's only one solution and that's our silver bullet and that's what's going to work, which is what we saw in Washington State, really, which blocked one plant from
But that is one
coming
reason
to
I think
fruition.
EPA declined to consider fuels in the midterm evaluation.
Yeah.
A heavy undergirding view that, look, we want to make sure we're keeping on the road, on track to get electric vehicles. And again, we totally applaud that. I mean, an electric vehicle doesn't happen to use any oil, talking about strategic consequences here. But it is a fact that that's a tension in looking at the fuel pool going forward.
Okay, so some kind of quick issues here. Well, lightning round, if you will. Prospects for CAFE reform, for renewable fuel standard reform. Brian, what do you think? Anything going to happen in the next year or two?
Renewable fuel standard, I think, has to come from the executive branch. There was some optimism for a while when, we were looking at unified control of Congress under the Republican Party, but I think momentum has stalled, and so any changes or solutions have to come from the executive branch.
Any energy bill do you think is going to happen? Anything?
Tough to know. Look, the energy bill last Congress failed for a variety of reasons. Chief among them, I think, was some of the Republican right thought they could get a more aggressive bill in this administration. With the circumstances kind of diverted from the standard policy making now. I just don't know what can move. I'm not aware of anything in the works that has a reasonable prospect of passing. So I guess my answer is, if at all, then no time soon.
How important is it for these guys to be up on the Hill talking to their members, writing their members, calling their members, letting them know the industry is out there and wants to be heard?
Yeah, absolutely. We're always there. Come visit. But yeah, more than anything, look, if you can pressure your own members where either you live, where you work, where your industry is headquartered, those are the folks that are really willing to listen to you. So, by all means, your representatives, your senators, call, write, push.
It makes a difference, right?
It makes a difference.
I mean, what constituents care about and jobs in the district are super important.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a sea change on Capitol Hill now. I work in a Democratic office, and we have Democratic constituents that are more energized now and more organized now than they have been in my close to 10 years on Capitol Hill. And that makes a difference. I see staff, I hear members talking about the efforts of their constituents. So yeah, it makes a difference.
All right, Joe, and part of what you do is really what Fuel Freedom does, is try and engage the grassroots. How much enthusiasm have you seen among grassroots to focus on this issue?
It varies depending on what kind of tweets that we send out, but there's a lot of interest. We're now trying to broaden that, from a. It turns out white males who fix their cars care a lot about what we're doing, so we're trying to broaden that out some. And but no, there's a lot of enthusiasm. We get hundreds of thousands of responses to some of our information that we put out on social media. But we tell them Congress is the thing. I mean, the only reason we care about social media and engaging at the popular level is to get those people to engage with Congress, because that's where that kind of change can happen.
Well, and the guys that fix their cars in their garage, they're the ones that really got momentum going on the plug-in hybrid vehicle front. I mean, I remember when we've been working on this issue for a really long time on fuel choice, and from the get-go, it was flex fuel vehicles, plug-in hybrid, and electric vehicles, really in parallel and together. But the two vehicles that really moved the needle on Capitol Hill, it was two converted Prii. People, just normal people, converted them to be plug-in hybrids, and they were flown over to Capitol Hill, and members drove them. And I remember this happening. I was actually with one member of Congress in a vehicle driving behind John Dingell, chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee then, and the executives, the CEOs of GM, Chrysler, and Ford, when they were giving a press conference and somebody was asking, so what's the reality, how realistic are plug-in hybrid vehicles? And they said not at all. And right behind them, this plug-in hybrid vehicle, and that's all she wrote. Really, policy on the Hill on plug-in hybrid vehicles started moving at that point. That was a seminal moment. I think the same thing. The guys that like to fix their cars, methanol is a high-octane fuel. If we think about the taxis in China, how many taxis have been converted to run on methanol? Because it's cheaper and it's cleaner and it's just a great fuel. In the U.S., we can't do that. So it's a huge constituency there. It's a better fuel. It was a NASCAR fuel, right?
I was going to close by, I just love Joe's recollection of the black telephone, because I remember that too. And I remember we had consumer choice when I was a kid. You could get a black telephone or a white telephone, and that was it. But I also appreciate Joe saying I'm a conservative, and I believe government has a role in promoting choice. And sometimes that's a great example. If you really want to promote choice in the telephone industry, you needed to have government play a role. And I think the same is probably true here. When I started reflecting upon what does the automobile industry have at stake here, what does the retail distribution gasoline industry have, I think it's going to be hard to get them to the table without government playing a role. Love to see it just in terms of making deals, But I think probably we need government to step in and play some type of role in making sure that we have a choice when it comes to fuel, and I hope that can happen.
You know, making deals, this gets back to, we have a deal maker in chief. We have one of the best deal makers in the world sitting in the White House, right? He's been talking about OPEC for years before he ran for president, saying OPEC is a problem. So I think it's super important to figure out a way, because I don't think he's an ideologue, to get President Trump engaged on this issue. I really do. I think that would be a game changer. And I can see, you know, a bill coming out of your office eventually signed by him. If he decides that this is something that's important enough for the American economy and for his jobs agenda, there's huge potential here. So talk about bringing all the people together in the room, you know, bringing the fuel industry guys, the automobile industry guys, the regulators, everybody together. Come on, make this happen. It shouldn't be so hard, right? We're talking about a really simple tweak.
I just said the one key thing here, though, is if you get wrapped around environmental policy and energy efficiency, what you really have to do is use that as a mechanism to unlock the energy dominance, the energy independence. So those two things don't normally come to mind here, but one is the key to the other, or could be the key to the other.
It gets back to, you know, to Brian's comment about the folks on the Foreign Affairs Committee. They really get this issue at a visceral level. They understand the threats that the United States, the free world faces. They understand that oil strategic importance is a threat. And so they think, okay, how do we go about dealing with this, right? I mean, the co-sponsors that you've had for this bill have been folks that have generally been coming at this from a geopolitical point of view, right? They care about the security side. But then in the Energy Committee, just by nature of who except for you guys and a few other members, it's mostly people that very naturally want to be on the committee because they have a constituent interest, upstream fuels producers in their district or automobile industry or something like that. And so, you know, they're not looking at it necessarily from the national point of view.
I was just following up on your deal maker president idea, because putting two things together, I mean, everyone knows about energy security and everybody knows about the environment. It's not that. It's just looking at one to leverage the other in a very significant way to change the status quo, i.e. take advantage of that huge, vast, affordable natural gas resource and do something with it that helps both the environment and energy security.
Yeah, I get back, you know, great state of Louisiana, great state of Texas, they need to hear that there is huge potential for natural gas to methanol in their states, and that will make a huge difference to their representatives.
And the great state of Michigan.
Great state
and
of
my home
Michigan.
State of Michigan. Let's not forget that.
Absolutely. You know, if you think about the auto industry, what is the worst thing that happens to the auto industry? Oil prices spike. Oil prices spike, vehicle sales plummet, right? There's a strong correlation there. Oil prices spike, people have less disposable income. They're going to be replacing their car less often. They're going to be driving less, and so on and so forth. So if you want to sell a lot of cars, you really want your cars to be effectively insured against oil price spikes. So if you have a car that lets people use lots of different fuels, your car is insured against oil price spikes. So you can do that for under $100 a car. It seems like a no-brainer to me. So on that note, yes, Gal? Were you raising your hand for a reason or just stretching? Stretching? That's a good reason. On that note, we are going to go to a well-deserved afternoon break, a very yummy break outside, sponsored by Methanex, and I would like to thank our panel.